Dear students, today we are going to discuss crowd and social movements. After studying this module, you shall be able to know about crowd and various theories of crowd behavior. Learn about social movements and related theories and evaluate the role of crowds in social movements. Collective behavior is a term sociologists use to refer to a miscellaneous set of behaviors in which large numbers of people engage. More specifically, collective behavior refers to relatively spontaneous and relatively unstructured behavior by large numbers of individuals acting with or being influenced by other individuals. Relatively spontaneous means that the behavior is somewhat spontaneous but also somewhat planned, while relatively unstructured means that the behavior is somewhat organized and predictable but also somewhat unorganized and unpredictable. As we shall see, some forms of collective behavior are more spontaneous and unstructured than others, and some forms are more likely than others to involve individuals who act together as opposed to merely being influenced by each other. As a whole, though collective behavior is regarded as less spontaneous and less structured than conventional behavior, such as what happens in a classroom, a workplace, or the other setting for everyday behavior with which we are very familiar. The term collective behavior refers to a miscellaneous set of behavior. As such, these behaviors often have very little in common with each other, even if their basic features allow them to be classified as collective behavior. Common forms of collective behavior discussed in this section include crowds, mobs, panics, riots, disaster behavior, rumors, mass hysteria, moral panics, and fates and crazes. Of these forms, some involve people who are not in each other's presence. In fact, they may be separated by hundreds or thousands of miles, but nonetheless share certain beliefs or concerns. Another common form of collective behavior is the social movement. The study of social movement exploded in the 1960s and 1970s, and social movement scholarship now dwarfs scholarship on other forms of collective behavior. The second part of this chapter thus focuses solely on social movement. Now we will discuss what is crowd. A crowd is a gathering of people who share an intent or purpose and influence each other. All the individuals in the crowd never do the same thing, as the behavior of each individual is differentiated from others. But crowd are not mindless. People in a crowd go around talking with each other. The process of making decision is not a systematic one because there are few shared agreements about how to make a collective decision. The proposals are made implicitly rather than verbally. There are some members in a crowd who agree with the decision and join in, whereas others disagree and attempt to prevent or do something else. Still, others just watch or leave the scene. An important feature of crowds is that they are not only shaped by society, but they can also bring societal change. The changes brought about by a crowd exist in three levels. First is, there is a change in the way the crowd members see themselves as social actors. In the beginning, people do not enter collective movements with full-fledged identities, but they understand about their society and who they are as a consequence of participation. The second is, crowd can lead to changes in collective ideologies. Social movements lead to new ideas, theories and new identities. Finally, crowd action can bring an entire restructuring of a society. Thus, it can be said that crowd action reflects the central paradox of human action. Crowds tend to exist in novel, ambiguous and fluid situations such that it is hard to apply routinized norms of behavior. They also tend to be unstructured such that both organized debate and use of a formal hierarchy to provide authoritative interpretations are not applicable. The crowd member face the challenge translating their superordinate social identity into a situational identity without the formal means of doing so. Many authors modify the common sense notion of the crowd to include episodes during which the participants are not assembled in one place but are dispersed over a large area. Turner and Killian refer to such episodes as diffuse crowds. Some psychologists state that there are three fundamental human emotions: fear, joy, anger. Milzer, Laughlin and others have proposed three corresponding forms of the crowd: the panic, an expression of fear; the craze, an expression of joy; and the hostile outburst, an expression of anger. Each of the three emotions can characterize either a compact or a diffuse crowd, the result being a scheme of 6 types of crowds. Now, the theories of crowd behavior. The first is emergent norm theory. Just after the mid-20th century, Turner and Killian presented their emergent norm theory of collective behavior, which downplayed the irrationality emphasized in earlier decades by Lebon and other intellectuals. According to Turner and Killian, when people start interacting in collective behavior, initially they are not sure how they are supposed to behave. As they discuss their potential behavior and other related matters, norms governing their behavior emerge, and social order and rationality then guide behavior. In at least two ways, emergent norm theory takes a middle ground between contagion theory and convergence theory. As should be clear, emergent norm theory views collective behavior as more rational than contagion theory does, but it also views collective behavior as less predictable than convergent theory does, as it assumes that people do not necessarily already share beliefs and intentions before they join a crowd. Next theory is social categorization theory. According to the social categorization theory, defining oneself as a member of social category is the precondition for group behavior. Such social identification entails a process of self-stereotyping whereby group members seek to conform to the beliefs and standards by which the category is defined. The shift from individual to group behavior involves a shift from personal to social identity and hence the emergence of cultural standards as a basis for behavioral control. Next is contagion theory. Contagion theory was developed by French scholar Gustave Le Bon. In his influential 1895 book, The Crowd, a study of the popular mind. Like many other intellectuals of his time, Le Bon was concerned about the breakdown of social order that was said to have begun with the French Revolution a century earlier and to have continued throughout the 19th century. Mob violence by the poor was common in the century in cities in Europe and the United States. Intellectuals who tended to live in relatively wealthy circumstances were very disturbed by the violence. They viewed it as irrational behavior and they thought that the people taking part in it were being unduly swayed by strong emotions and the influence of others people in the mobs. Le Bon's book and its contagion theory reflected these intellectual beliefs. When individuals are by themselves, he wrote, they act rationally, but when they are in a crowd, they come under its almost hypnotic influence and act irrationally and emotionally. They no longer can control their unconscious instincts and become violent and even savage. In short, contagion theory argues that collective behavior is irrational and results from the contagious influence of the crowds in which individuals find themselves. Contagion theory assumes that people in a crowd act emotionally and irrationally because they come under the influence of the crowd's impulses. The views of contagion theory were popular well into the 20th century, but scholars came to believe the collective behavior is much more rational than Le Bon thought, and also that individuals are not controlled by crowd influences as he thought. Next theory is convergence theory. Convergence theory is one of the theories that presented this new understanding of collective behavior. According to this theory, crowds do not unduly influence individuals to act in emotional and even violent ways. Rather, crowd behavior reflects and behavior and attitudes of the individuals who decide to join a crowd. Once they converge in a crowd, the behavior of the crowd is a consequence of their behavior and attitude. Instead of the crowd affecting the individuals in it, the individual in it affect the crowd. Reflecting the adage that birds of a feather flock together. People who feel in a certain way about a particular issue and who wish to act in a certain way tend to find and converge with similar people. The crowd they form then reflects their beliefs and desired activities. As Goodey says that the way people act in a crowd or publics is an expression or outgrowth of who they are ordinarily. It argues that like-minded people come together in or converge on a certain location where collective behavior can and will take place, where individuals can act out tendencies or traits they had in the first place. Convergence theory does not deny that people may do something in a crowd that they would not do by themselves, but it does say that what a crowd does largely reflects the individuals who compose it. If we think of a mob or at least a small group of people who commit a hate crime, for example, gay bashing, we can see an application of convergence theory. The individuals who form this group are people who hate homosexuality and who hate gays and lesbians. The group violence they commit reflects these beliefs. Next is social movement. Bloomer's final form of collective behavior is the social movement. He identifies several types of social movements. For example, active social movements such as the French Revolution and expressive social movements such as Alcoholic Anonymous. An active movement tries to change society, an expressive one tries to change its own members. Real social movements are complex mixture of ideological declaration by leaders, diverse actions undertaken by crowds, and organization shift in actions and consciousness of people. In real social movements, action affect other actions. They are not just independent, isolated movements. Oliver and Marvel define social movement as a large complex set of collective events oriented towards some general social change goal. The most important feature of this definition is its sharp distinction between any single collective action oriented movements which encompasses many different actions. In this view, social movement encompasses a wide variety of action oriented toward a variety of specific goals, employing a variety of specific goals, employing a variety of ideological interpretations and undertaken by a variety of actors. A social movement consists of network of people and groups who share a collective identity and who try to prevent or promote societal change by non-institutionalized tactics. An important part of what happens in social movement is that people change their feelings about themselves and change the way they deal with others. It is not just that the activists undergo a process of conversion and grow in their commitment to the movement. Although this event is largely important, non-activists and the people who do not even support the movement are changed in ways that contribute to the overall trust and impact of the movement. Whole social movements are complex phenomena encompassing organizations, informal groups, crowds, consciousness and interactions among all these elements. Many social movements start as a reaction to change or new policy and negatively affect the way of life of many people. Following are the two theories of social movement. First is breakdown theory. A period of rapid social change weakens and undermines stable groups, and as a result social movements flourish. The greater their hardship from dislocation, greater the number of movements, and the most uprooted, dissatisfied people are likely to be adherents of social movement. The next theory is solidarity theory. Social movements will not form when one capacity to act collectively and in opportunities of success are low. Increase in dissatisfaction and grievances are important for explaining social movement growth. Next is model of social movement. Social movement are complex aggregates of actions. It is important to understand how the mechanism of various kinds of actions by widely separated groups of individuals can affect each other and accumulate and have a kind of unified effect. Communication process. In a social movement, the communication links are never perfect, and as they never carry all possible information. Thus, process that determine exactly what information gets transmitted are crucial features of social movements. There is an effect of mass media or social movements. Both mass communication and personal communication are important in all social movements. People discuss and evaluate the information they hear from the mass media, and they use the mass media to check the news they hear through personal sources. Now, the process of interpreting and deciding. In a social movement, decisions are made by different kinds of collective entities like organizations, informal groups, crowds, and local collectivities. Each kind of collective entity has its distinctive pattern of decision making, but some general principles apply to all. In all cases, it is ultimately individuals who make choices about their actions, but these choices are made in interaction with others. The fundamental process of collective decision is the same. People talk to each other about what to do. Some individuals start to act in a particular ways, then other individuals decide whether to cooperate with this action, do something else. It is this process which produces collective decision. The important thing about collective movements is that the collective decisions by one collective entity are influenced by the collective decisions of other entities. Now, how actions affect other actions? The communicated and interpreted information about one action by one collective can affect the prospect for subsequent action by another collectivity. The action in a social movement can affect various other actions and produce various changes which are presented in the diagram below. For example, changes in objective conditions, changes in social organization, changes in beliefs, changes in self-perception, and changes in knowledge. Next point is crowds in social movement. being major agents of social change, perhaps the most studied form of collective behavior are social movements. Collective behavior refers to the spectrum of crowd behavior, which includes demonstration, attending a rally at state capitol, and other collective manifestations of citizens exercising their constitutional right peacefully to assemble and question the government. The episodes of collective behavior are infrequent and unusual. They attract curiosity and comment and elicit support and condemnation. Social movements are large-scale collective effort to bring about to resist changes that bear on the lives of many. Social movements are always some form of actions, while early crowd behavior theorists such as Levon believed crowds to be violent and mindless. Crowd can be better understood through the lens of social identity acting towards attainment of group goals. In contrast to a mob, people in a crowd display extraordinary restraint and vigilance as they look after the well-being of fellow in-group members. People make different choices in isolation than they do in crowds. It is so because of two factors. First, the norms applicable for crowds situation are not the same as for individual in an ordinary situation. Second, the benefits and cost for a member of the crowd differ from what it is for isolated individuals making a choice, since people in a crowd behave strategically. Although crowd have not been comfortably handled by many social movements, but this doesn't imply that crowds are not studied in social movements. There is in fact fairly lively literature concerning the relative value of unruly crowds and organizations for producing social change on behalf of oppressed population. The individuals in the crowd never do the same thing, rather the behavior of each individual is differentiated from others. But crowds are not mindless. People in a crowd go around talking with each other, a process called mining. The process of making decision is not a systematic one because there are few shared agreements about how to make a collective decision. The proposals are made implicitly rather than verbally. There are some members in a crowd who agree with the decision and join in, whereas others disagree and attempt to prevent or do something else. Still, others just watch or leave the scene. In short, crowd events that are part of larger social movements can be fully understood only in that larger movement context. The particular participants of any event emerge from a larger community of discourse, a collectivity within which shared beliefs, norms, and values are created. The crowd in a social movement cannot be understood apart from this context. Now, let us summarize what we have discussed. The term collective behavior refers to social processes and events which do not reflect existing social structure but which emerge in a spontaneous way. Collective behavior might also be defined as actions which is neither confirming no deviant. Further point is, it takes place when norms are absent or unclear, or when they contradict each other. For example, religious revival meetings. The classic treatment of crowd is Gustave Le Bon's book, The Crowd, a study of the popular mind, in which the author interpreted the crowds of the French Revolution as irrational reversions to animal emotion, and inferred from this such reversion is characteristic of crowd in general. Le Bon believed that crowds somehow induced people to lose their ability to think rationally and to somehow recover this ability once they had left the crowd. He speculated but could not explain how this might occur. Freud expressed a similar view in Group Psychology and the Analysis of Ego. Such authors have thought that their ideas were confirmed by various kinds of crowds, one of these being the economic bubble. In Holland, during the tulip mania, the prices of tulip bulbs rose to astronomical heights. An era of such crazes and other historical oddities is narrated in Charles Mackay's Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. Bloomer's final form of collective behavior is the social movement. He identifies several types of social movements: active social movements such as the French Revolution, and expressive social movements such as Alcoholics Anonymous. An active movement tries to change society, an expressive one tries to change its own members. Next point is, whole social movements are complex phenomena encompassing organization, informal groups, crowds, consciousness and interactions among all these elements. Social movements should not be understood as static thing, but chain of reactions, as action of one place in an entity influences actions of other kinds in other places by other entities.